The containment order arrived at 0340, printed on Compact Medical Authority letterhead, hand-delivered by a man in a sealed suit who left it folded on the camp's intake counter and backed away before I could argue. I read it standing in the tent doorway, with the pre-dawn cold coming off the flats, the gas lantern swinging above me on its hook, coffee going cold in my hand. 6 paragraphs, dense with regulatory language, referencing 3 separate statutes I knew by number and 2 I had to look up. The language was careful and thorough, and it meant one thing. The child in cot 7 of my triage tent was classified as a Category 2 biological vector, and I had 72 hours to transfer her to compact containment unit custody for quarantine processing. I folded the order and put it in my coat pocket and went back inside. I have spent 26 years in field medicine. I have worked in camps on 4 different corridors, a station hospital that lost power for 9 days during a regional infrastructure failure, a field hospital established in what was functionally a drainage trench during the Tariff relief operation, and twice on emergency medical vessels doing inter-transit casualty triage, in conditions that made the word rustic sound like a compliment. In all of that time, I have received a great many orders on compact letterhead. Some of them were right, some of them were wrong. The ones that were wrong were usually wrong, not because the people who wrote them were malicious. Most of the people who write compact medical orders are not malicious. They are overworked and under-resourced, and operating on information that is never quite complete. But because the gap between a document and the reality it is meant to address is always larger than the document assumes. The document says Category 2 biological vector. The reality is cot 7. Cot 7 was in the corner farthest from the entrance, separated from the other patients by a partition screen I had put up myself 3 days earlier. Not because I believed the vector classification, because the other patients were frightened of her, and she deserved a corner of the world where nobody flinched when she moved. She was asleep, amber-skinned. The Veth characteristic, though the amber had gone slightly ashen over the past 48 hours from the fever. She was small even by Veth standards, narrow shoulders, limbs that folded in a way a human child's do not, the ridgeline of bioluminescent tissue that ran from her temple down along her jaw and dropped to her collarbone, lying quiet and dark in sleep, the way it always went dark when she was resting. When she was awake and distressed, it lit. That was what had set the camp's medical tech off. 3 days ago, when he'd logged her intake, the light. He had written fever, luminescence, unknown origin, and had flagged it to the regional compact medical coordinator, who had escalated it to the containment unit, issued the order I now had in my pocket. I had 26 years of xenobiological field medicine behind me, and I had known what the light was from the moment I first saw it. But knowing and having the paperwork to prove it were different things, and the compact ran on paperwork, and the man in the sealed suit, now waiting outside the camp wire, was very sure he had his. I sat down on the stool beside cot 7 and watched her breathe. Veth respiratory rhythm is slower than human, 16 to 19 seconds between cycles instead of 4 to 5. In the first day, I had caught 2 of my junior staff checking her pulse in a panic because they thought she had stopped breathing. She had not. She was Veth. Her lungs were structured differently. Her oxygen exchange happened in a long, deep draw rather than the rapid, shallow rhythm of a human. It was one of the first things we covered in basic xenobiological orientation. Basic orientation was a long time ago for most of the staff here, and the camp was running at 140% capacity, and nobody had slept properly in 2 weeks. A child who glowed in the dark and breathed like she was almost not breathing was exactly the kind of thing that cracked exhausted people. I had not let it crack me. That was, I suppose, my qualification for the next 6 days. Name, or the closest approximation I could manage, was something in the Veth lower register that my human larynx could not reproduce. It translated roughly as still water in morning, which the camp's intake system had abbreviated to the letter S, and then a numeric code. I had written Sail on her intake chart because she needed a name somebody could say out loud without embarrassment, because still water in morning was not wrong exactly. She had that quality. When she was calm, she was very calm. When the camp's noise or the other patient's fear pressed in on her, she did not cry. She went quieter, and the ridge light dimmed further, and she folded herself into as small a shape as she could manage. She had arrived 3 days before the containment order, carried in by a camp volunteer who had found her sitting alone in the dust on the camp's eastern perimeter, 50 meters outside the wire. No family group, no baggage of any kind. Just the child, sitting with her knees drawn up and her ridge light cycling slow and dim, which, in Veth physiological terms, means the organism is under prolonged stress and conserving resources. The volunteer, a retired schoolteacher named Hess, who did this work because she could not stop doing it, had picked her up without hesitation and carried her in through the wire and through the intake processing area, and all the way to the triage tent. She had not set her down until she had to, which I noted at the time as a human response, so instinctive it had bypassed the language entirely. Hess had not asked anyone if she was allowed to pick up an alien child sitting alone in the dust. She had picked her up. That was its own kind of data point. Triage had handed her to me because I was the senior medical officer on shift and nobody else had wanted the decision. It was not a complicated decision, the taking of it. That surprised some of the staff, I think. Or rather, the absence of my visible hesitation surprised them. A Veth child with unknown presentation, glowing, alone, in a camp that had no pediatric Veth protocol and was already operating at the edge of its capacity. There were reasons to be uncertain. There were reasons to wait, to escalate, to convene a brief staff discussion before committing resources to an intake that fell outside every existing protocol. I did not convene a discussion. I cleaned her up and took her vitals and set her in cot 7. 26 years teaches you that the question of whether to help is almost never the hard question. It only feels hard when you are new, or when you are tired, or when the institutional pressure has been long enough and consistent enough to make the question feel more complicated than it is. The hard question is how. The how is what requires training and documentation and experience and the willingness to be methodical when everything in you wants to move faster. The weather has the same answer every time. The flinching was subtle. Veth children do not flinch the way human children do, with the whole body, the reflexive shrink. They do it with their eyes. The hexagonal pupils contract when they are startled, pulling tight, and I had watched hers contract. Every time footsteps came too close to the partition. Every time a voice rose on the other side of the screen. Every time the tent flap moved. I counted the flinches per hour in my head, which was an informal measure but a useful one. By the end of the first hour, I had the rate. By the end of the second, it was down. She stayed. Then I had gone through every Veth pediatric reference in the camp's medical database and built a care protocol from scratch, because there was not an existing one. This camp handled Veth adults occasionally, not children, and the protocols for adults were inadequate for a child's smaller body mass, lower metabolic rate, and different immune architecture. I pulled everything I had. The papers from my field medical corps training, the archived case studies from the 2 camps I had worked that had had significant Veth populations, the xenobiological pediatrics module from a continuing education certification I had completed 6 years ago and had not expected to need in quite this form. By the end of that first day, I had a care protocol. By the end of the second day, I had a working diagnosis. The child was not ill in any communicable sense. She was in a prolonged stress response that her body was expressing through the ridge light cycling, in a fever pattern, elevated intensity, irregular interval, warm spectrum shift toward gold. Rather than the usual blue-white of a calm Veth, Veth bioluminescence is not an infection. It is not a contagion vector. It is a biological communication and stress regulation system, and in children, under a certain developmental threshold. It can cycle out of regulation when the organism is under sustained environmental stress, specifically, alone, frightened, displaced, and without kin contact for an extended period. That was my diagnosis. The ridge light was not a symptom of disease. It was a symptom of loneliness. The camp's medical tech had not known this. He had 22 months in the field, and a general medical certification, and a manual that had not been updated in 8 years, and did not mention Veth bioluminescent stress response at all, because the population of Veth refugees moving through compact space at the time the manual was written was negligible. He had seen a child who glowed and ran a fever and flagged it, which was exactly what he was supposed to do with unknowns. I was not angry at him. I was angry at the 7-paragraph containment order sitting in my coat pocket, which had been written by people who had access to the current literature and had chosen not to consult it. I had 72 hours, spent the first 12 of them at my desk. The camp's medical database was not comprehensive, but it was connected to the compact medical archive, and I had a research authorization from my years with the Field Medical Corps that had never been formally revoked when I moved into independent. I used it. I pulled every peer-reviewed study on Veth bioluminescent physiology published in the past 15 years. 41 papers, 2 systematic reviews, 1 longitudinal study on pediatric stress responses in isolated Veth individuals that had been conducted on a different refugee corridor entirely, but was directly applicable here. I read them in sequence, making notes in the margin of a legal pad I had taken from the camp administrator's supply closet, which I had not asked permission to take, and was not going to return. Because what I was building needed to be on paper, as well as in the system. Paper is harder to lose. Paper shows the work. I cross-referenced everything against the child's intake vitals and the measurements I had been taking, twice daily since she arrived. I built a case record, 73 pages, structured in the format required by Compact Medical Authority for a formal diagnostic challenge to a containment classification. The structure is not intuitive. I had done this once before, 12 years ago, on a different matter entirely, and the format had changed since then, and I had to spend 40 minutes finding the current template in the archive before I could begin. 40 minutes I did not have, technically. I spent them. Because a filing submitted in the wrong format can be rejected on technical grounds before it is read, and I was not going to give the review board that. 73 pages is a great deal of paperwork. I had written longer in worse conditions. A field hospital on Tareth Station, no power for 4 days, half my staff down with a contact respiratory illness, composing clinical records by hand because the systems were offline. Compared to that, this was comfortable. I had coffee. I had a working lamp. I had the database in 26 years and a very clear sense of what the truth was, and the only task was getting the truth into a format the compact would have to acknowledge. Between the writing, I went back to Cot 7, twice an hour, sometimes more. Temperature, ridge light cycle rate, respiratory rhythm, fluid intake. I made her drink from the hydration pack I had rigged at the head of the cot. The Veth-compatible formula, diluted to pediatric concentration, required a calculation I had done from first principles, because the camp's dosage tables did not go small enough. She drank when I offered it. Eagerly, not with any visible enthusiasm, but she drank. This was a good sign. In severe stress response, Veth individuals sometimes stop eating and drinking, which accelerates a cascade I did not want to see. That she drank meant she was still, some level, expecting to continue. At hour 14, a compact containment officer came to the camp gate and asked to speak with me. I sent word back that I was filing a formal diagnostic challenge under Compact Medical Authority Statute 7 Sigma, and would speak with them once the filing was complete. This was true. It was also a reason to make them wait, which was what I needed. He was still there at hour 22 when I finished. I transmitted the filing to the Compact Medical Authority Review Board at IRO 130, hard copied it, and sent the hard copy by registered courier to the regional coordinator's office, and sent a third copy directly to the containment unit's commanding officer by internal compact courier. Cost me 40 credits I did not have, but established a paper trail that could not be argued away. 3 copies, 3 channels. If any one of them was lost or delayed or administratively misfiled, the others existed. Then I went back to Cot 7 and checked the child's vitals. Ridge light intensity down slightly, temperature holding, respiratory rhythm normal, and went to sleep in the chair next to her partition screen with my coat over my shoulders. I woke 3 hours later to someone knocking on the tent frame. It was my junior medic, Davin. 24 years old, 3 months into his first field posting, competent in a way that had surprised me when I first assessed him. He had the instincts that training does not create. The willingness to stay in a room with uncertainty rather than reaching for a premature answer. He had a mug of something hot and he held it out without speaking. which was the correct instinct. I took it. What time is it? 044. Any word from the containment unit? The officer at the gate wants to know when you'll be available to discuss the transfer. When the review board responds. I drank. It was not coffee. It was some reconstituted grain drink the camp ran on when the coffee supply ran low, which was always. It tasted like warm paper, but it was hot, and I was grateful. Tell him that. He's not going to like that. No. I looked through the partition screen. The ridge light was cycling slow and even the blue-white of a calm sleep. He's going to like it less than I do. But the filing is in, and the review board has 48 hours to respond under the statute. And until they do, she stays here. Davin looked at the partition. He was from somewhere in the inner systems, had never been assigned to a camp that handled significant Veth populations, and had spent the first 2 days keeping a careful professional distance from Cot 7. On the third day, I had caught him standing at the gap in the partition screen, watching the child sleep, with an expression on his face I recognized because I had worn it myself 20-odd years ago, in a different camp on a different corridor. The expression of someone recalibrating, the slight forward lean, the stillness, particular kind of quiet that comes over a person when the fact on the ground and the category they had filed it in stop matching up. Is she actually going to be okay? He said. She's going to be fine. She needs kin contact and she needs time. And the stress response will regulate on its own once she has those things. The ridge light will go back to normal cycling. The fever pattern will resolve. I paused. What she does not need is to be transferred to a containment facility where she will have neither of those things, and where the personnel are equipped to handle biological threats rather than frightened children, and where the outcome for a Veth child in a prolonged stress response without kin contact would be. I stopped. I did not finish that sentence because I did not need to, and because finishing it would make it real in a way I was not prepared for at 0440, in a camp chair with a mug of grain drink. Davin understood. He had the face of someone who understood. Okay, he said. Go tell the officer his answer. He went. I sat with her until first light. The thing about a prolonged stress response in a Veth child is that they do not show it the way a human child would. A human child, separated from family, frightened, feverish, in an unfamiliar place full of strangers. You know what they do. They cry. They call out. They grab for whoever is nearest. The proximity seeking is biological, hardwired, loud. You can hear it from 20 meters. You can feel it across a room. There is something in the human nervous system that responds to a crying child with an urgency that bypasses thought, and I have always believed this is not a flaw in our design but the central feature of it. A Veth child goes inward. They go very, very still. The ridge light dims and slows, which in adult Veth physiology signals calm, but in a child in stress signals withdrawal. A conservation response. The organism pulling its resources inward because the outward environment has become unsafe. It looks, to an untrained eye, like calm. It looks like a child who is coping, adjusting, perhaps even recovering. It is the opposite of calm. It is a child who has stopped expecting help to come from outside. She had been in that state when they brought her in. She had been in it, to a lesser degree, for 3 days. I knew what I was looking at because I had the literature, and because I had been doing this work for a long time. There is a difference between knowing what you are looking at in a clinical sense, and sitting next to it at 4 in the morning, and feeling the weight of it. The weight of a child who has learned not to ask. I talked to her. In those early morning hours before the camp woke, I talked. Not in any language she understood. My Veth was limited to intake-level phrases, enough to communicate basic needs, but low and steady. The way you talk to any small creature in distress when what you have to offer is not words but presence. The presence is not nothing. In a prolonged stress response, the organism's cortisol analog levels are elevated. Cortisol analog suppression in Veth physiology is partially regulated by infrasonic environmental input, meaning the presence of kin, whose infrasonic vocalization is below human hearing range, but is physiologically meaningful for the Veth nervous system. I could not produce an infrasonic vocalization. What I could produce was a human voice at a steady low register, which is not the same thing, but is in the same frequency neighborhood, and which the Veth nervous system appears to process as a less optimal version, of a similar signal. It was not science exactly, it was the best I had. I told her things without meaning to, sitting there in the lamplight with my coat over my shoulders and the grain drink going cold in my hands. I told her about my first field posting, 30 years ago, which had been cold and underfunded and staffed by people who were tired before the crisis arrived. I told her about the things I had learned that year, that no training program teaches. The specific texture of a night when you have done everything you can do and must wait. The way waiting is itself a skill. The way it is possible to be useful by staying rather than moving. Told her about a woman I had worked with on that first posting, Dr. Arvith, who had been 63 years old and had seen everything, and had a particular way of sitting with a patient in the pre-dawn hours that I had tried to learn and had never fully managed. I told her I was still working on it, and I told her, and I am not proud of this exactly, but I am not ashamed of it either, that I was not going to let the man at the gate take her, and that this was not a complicated decision, and that she had not done anything wrong. The ridge light cycled. Dim, then a little brighter. Dim again. Each cycle may be 30-35 seconds, the irregular interval of the fever pattern, but the pulses were warm, not the cool blue-white of the deep withdrawal. Something in my voice was registering. I do not know how much she understood. I know she was not asleep during some of it. The respiratory rhythm shifts slightly, a nearly imperceptible shortening of the cycle, 10 to 15 seconds instead of 16 to 19. When a Veth individual is awake and tracking their environment, I had learned to read it over the past 3 days. She was awake more than I expected, lying still with her eyes mostly closed, the hexagonal pupils showing a thin ring of amber-dark iris at the edge, listening to a voice she could not understand, in a camp that was not her home, with a man at the gate who wanted to take her somewhere worse. She did not cry, she listened. I stayed until the camp woke up around us. On the morning of the second full day after the filing, I received a response from the Compact Medical Authority Review Board. It was not the response I wanted. They had reviewed the preliminary filing and found it did not, on its face, constitute sufficient grounds to stay the containment order. They were requesting supplemental documentation, specifically, a full metabolic panel using compact standard xenobiological assay protocols, a comparative tissue sample assessment against the current compact biological threat classification index, and a secondary opinion certification from a licensed compact medical authority xenobiologist. I had 14 hours to provide all three before the containment order's 72-hour window expired, and the compact containment unit had legal authority to compel the transfer. I read the response 3 times. They wanted 3 documents in 14 hours, a refugee camp on the outer corridor during a regional quarantine. The metabolic panel required equipment we barely had and protocols written, laboratory conditions we did not have. The comparative tissue assessment required reference samples that I suspected were out of date, but had no choice except to use. And the secondary opinion certification required a licensed compact medical authority xenobiologist to review my case and sign their name to it in 14 hours. When every licensed specialist in range was either deployed or locked down under their own institutional calls. It was designed to be difficult. I do not know if it was designed with that intention. I have never assumed malice when a sufficiently large and self-reinforcing institutional system can produce the same result through inertia alone. But it was difficult, and it was intentional in the sense that the review board knew what they were asking for and had chosen to ask for it anyway. 14 hours on the clock, I started making calls. The metabolic panel I could do myself. The camp had the equipment, barely, and I had the training, and the Veth-specific parameters were in the literature I had already pulled. I prepped the sample I had taken 2 days earlier and preserved in our camp's storage. The panel took 4 hours and required me to manually recalibrate our camp's assay reader 3 times, because the calibration had drifted and nobody had corrected it in 6 months, which was a problem I was going to flag separately and with considerable specificity in my incident report. Results, once I had them, were unambiguous. No pathogenic organisms, no novel biological compounds, no toxin profiles, nothing on the compact biological threat classification index. What the panel showed was a Veth child with elevated cortisol analogs, the xenobiological equivalent of a stress hormone, and ridge-luminescent tissue cycling at 1.8 times baseline rate due to sustained adrenergic stimulation, stress, physiological, measurable, documented stress, nothing else. That was documentation 1. The tissue sample comparison took another 2 hours, and a significant portion of my patients, because the Compact's comparative tissue sample protocol was written for conditions rather different from a refugee camp triage tent. The reference samples in our system were 3 years out of date, which I discovered midway through the comparison when the dating metadata came up in the file header, and I stopped and stared at it for a longer moment than I should have spent standing still. 3 years. The Compact was asking me to compare the child's tissue profile against a reference baseline that predated the current taxonomy update by 18 months and therefore did not reflect 3 significant revisions to the Veth biological classification entries. I flagged the data age in my filing, cited the specific update cycle failure under Compact Medical Data Maintenance, Statute 12b, and used the samples anyway, noting in the documentation that any anomalies between the reference samples and current Compact standards were attributable to the data maintenance failure and not to the child's physiology. I then filed a separate formal complaint about the outdated reference samples, would accomplish nothing in the next 14 hours, but would, eventually, be someone's problem. I wanted it on record that I had noticed. For building a case inside the Compact's own system, the system's failures become part of the case. You document them the same way you document everything else, cleanly and specifically, without editorial comment, and let the facts accumulate their own weight. That was documentation 2. The secondary opinion certification was harder. A licensed Compact medical authority xenobiologist, willing to review and sign off on a case assessment for a refugee camp in the outer corridor in 14 hours, during a regional quarantine period, when every licensed specialist in range was either deployed or locked down by their own institutional protocols. I went through the Compact's licensed xenobiologist directory for the regional sector. The directory was not easy to navigate. It was organized by institutional affiliation rather than geographic availability, is a design choice that has baffled me for as long as I have been using it, and which I noted in my incident report under a section I labeled Administrative Infrastructure Failures, grew to 4 pages before I was done with it. I called 4. 3 did not answer. 1 answered, and told me he was in the middle of a containment response on another corridor and could not assist, which was true and fair, and he said he was sorry in a way that suggested he meant it, which was also true and fair. The 4th was a woman named Dr. Peril Andrus. Retired from Compact Medical Authority Xenobiology Division 8 years ago, running a small research practice on a station 4 hours transit from the camp. She was listed in the directory as inactive, but her communication channel was live. I called it. She answered on the 2nd attempt. She listened without interrupting while I explained the situation. I had learned, over 26 years, that the most important thing you can do when asking someone for a significant favor under time pressure is to give them the complete picture in a single, clear statement rather than parceling it out and requiring them to ask questions before they can decide. People will say yes or no based on what they know. Give them what they need to know. Send me the full case record, she said, when I had finished. Metabolic panel, tissue comparison, your clinical observations from intake, everything. Sending now. I'll need 2 hours to review. 2 hours. And if I agree with your assessment, which, based on what you've described, I expect I will, I can provide written secondary certification by Secure Compact Medical Channel. That's your 3rd document. That's my 3rd document. Another pause. How old is she? I look through the partition. I don't know exactly. Veth developmental staging is difficult to assess without kin reference. Best estimate from bone density and ridge tissue maturation is early middle childhood. Young, Dr. Andrus was quiet for a moment. Then, send the record. She signed off in 1 hour and 40 minutes. The certification was 6 pages, meticulous, citing 14 peer-reviewed sources and a Compact Medical Authority xenobiology directive from 4 years ago that explicitly defined Veth bioluminescent stress cycling as a non-communicable physiological response that was not to be classified as a biological vector event without a positive pathogen identification. The directive had a compact document number. It had been circulated to all regional medical coordinators. It had, apparently, not reached the containment unit's operating protocols. I added a notation to my filing about the directive's non-incorporation into containment unit protocols and cited the specific procedural gap that allowed a 4-year-old clarifying directive to remain invisible to the field, operators most likely to encounter the clinical presentation it addressed. I did this without editorializing. I simply documented the gap, gave it a statutory reference, and moved on. I packaged the 3 documents, attached them to the review board's request, and filed the supplemental submission with 4 hours remaining. Then I went back to Cot 7 and sat down and did not do anything for a while. She was awake. She had been awake more frequently in the past day. The ridge light cycling in short, irregular bursts, which the literature described as an orientation response. A VETH individual assessing their environment at intervals to determine whether it was stable. She was doing what any creature does in an unfamiliar place, checking. Is this still here? Is this still safe? Is the person next to me still the same person who was here before? I had been the same person. I had made sure of that. Davin had been the same person in my absences. We had built a small, reliable world inside the partition screen. Same faces, same voices, same schedule of vitals and fluids and the reconstituted VETH-compatible nutrition packs that the camp kept in limited supply for adult VETH patients, and which I had been using at pediatric dosages, which meant we were burning through the supply faster than the camp's logistics had anticipated. Was someone else's problem, and I was content for it to be. The nutrition packs were one of the first things that had gone right between us. First offering. The first 2 times I had pushed a pack toward her, she had looked at it and then at me and not moved. Not refusal exactly, not fear, but the careful non-commitment of a creature that does not yet know what accepting means in this context. On the 3rd day I had opened one myself and taken a small amount. The flavor was not suited to human palatability, but it was not actively harmful. I had checked and left the pack in her reach and sat back, and after 11 minutes she had picked it up. I know it was 11 minutes because I had been watching the clock on the medical tent wall and counting. It's the kind of thing you do when you have nothing to do but sit and wait, and the thing you are waiting for matters. After that, she took the packs when I offered them. That was not trust in any full sense, but it was a beginning. She looked at me when I came back through the partition after filing the supplemental submission. Just looked, those amber dark VETH eyes. The irises very wide in the dim tent light, the pupils structured differently from a human's, hexagonal rather than circular, which is the detail that still catches me. Even now, even having worked with VETH patients for years, the hexagonal pupil, it does not look wrong. It looks precise, like something made to see clearly. She looked at me and the ridge light did something I had not seen it do before. It pulsed once, warm gold, temple backward along the jawline. A clean single wave and then settled. In the literature, single direct pulse in the warm gold spectrum from a VETH child toward a non-VETH individual is categorized as a recognition signal. Not friendship, not trust in the full sense. Those require kin registration, which is a longer biological process with its own distinct signaling. Recognition. This one I know. I had been sitting next to her for 4 days. I had taken her blood pressure twice daily, and her temperature 3 times daily, and I had talked in the pre-dawn dark, and I had made sure the same faces came through the partition. I had opened a nutrition pack and tasted it so she could see me do it. I had stayed when the man at the gate was waiting, and she had learned me, the way children learn the things that stay. Put my hand on the edge of the cot, not touching her, just near. The way you sit with someone who has been through something hard, who does not need to be touched, but who should not be alone. She looked at the hand, then back at my face, and the ridge light settled into its even cycle. I said her name. Sail. The ridge light pulsed once more. Warm, quiet. We're going to be okay, I said, which was not a clinical assessment. It was something else, not a doctor talking. I filed the documents. Now we wait. She did not understand the words. But she had been reading me for 4 days, and whatever she read in my face at that moment, she went back to sleep. Respiratory cycle lengthened and slowed to its full resting interval. The ridge light dimmed to its sleeping blue-white. She folded herself into the position she had found that she preferred, one arm beneath her head, and breathed in the long, slow Veth rhythm, and I sat beside her and waited for the review board. The response came at 0210, 7 hours before the containment orders window closed. Capped Medical Authority Review Board, Regional Corridor 7. Case reference 4419 VEC. After review of supplemental documentation including metabolic analysis, comparative tissue assessment, and secondary opinion certification from a licensed xenobiologist, the Category 2 biological vector classification is hereby suspended pending full review. The suspended classification carries with it an automatic stay of the associated containment order. The stay is effective immediately and remains in force until the board's full review is complete. A timeline of no fewer than 30 days. 30 days. The containment unit had no authority to compel a transfer during a classification suspension. 30 days meant I could file the full case record into the permanent compact medical database. 30 days meant the case would be reviewed by people who had not issued the original order, and therefore had no institutional stake in defending it. 30 days meant, in practical terms, that the classification was dead. When the board did its full review of a case built on 73 pages of documentation, 2 additional supporting documents, and assigned secondary certification from a retired compact xenobiologist, the classification would be revoked, and a corrective notation would be added to the compact standard protocols for Veth biological presentations. It would not fix the underlying problem, the outdated field manual, the undertrained staff, the containment unit's operating protocols that had never been updated to incorporate the 4-year-old directive. Those problems would persist until someone fixed them, and fixing them was not my job in this moment. My job in this moment was a child in cot 7. I sent word to the gate. The containment officer did not take it well. He came to the camp entrance and asked to speak with me personally, and I went out and stood at the wire in the dark and let him be angry, because that was fair enough. He had been standing at a gate in a sealed suit 3 days, and now he was being told his order had been stayed and his unit was going home empty-handed. He said several things in a raised voice about proper authority and jurisdictional protocol, and the dangers of non-specialists interfering with public health infrastructure. He was not wrong that those were real concerns in the abstract. He was wrong about the specific case in front of him, and the review board had agreed with me, and I had nothing else to say about it. I waited until he was finished. The stay is in effect, I said. The documentation is filed. If you want to contest it, you can file a review challenge with the board, and the response timeline for that is 45 days. I paused. She is a child with a stress response. She is not a contagion. She does not belong in a containment facility. The board has agreed with me on that, and I expect, when the full review is complete, the record will agree with me as well. I paused again. I'm going back inside. I went back inside. The camp was very quiet at 0230. The generator hum, the far-off sound of someone in another tent coughing, the wind coming off the flats. Walked back to cot 7 and sat down, and I did something I had not done in some time, which was put my face in my hands and breathe. Just breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way I teach patients to do it, when the situation is overwhelming them, which I apparently needed to do myself occasionally at 54 years old. She was watching me when I lifted my head, the ridge light cycling slow, her head turned slightly toward me, that Veth orientation gesture I had come to know. A small, deliberate turn, nothing like a human's casual glance, precise and considered. Are you still the same? Are you still here? It's done, I said. For now, it's done. The ridge light pulsed, warm gold. Once. I laughed, which surprised me. Not a large laugh, a quiet one, the kind that comes out when something has been very hard for a long time, and something has also just gone right. The kind that is more relief than amusement, though it has the shape of amusement and will do. She watched me laugh. Expression did not change. Veth facial musculature is less mobile than human, and reading emotion on a Veth face is a matter of reading the whole body. The ridge light The posture, the hexagonal pupils dilating or contracting. Pupils were wide. She watched me with wide, dark pupils and the ridge light at a warm cycle, and I had the sense, which I could not quantify clinically, but which I have come to trust after 26 years, that she understood something had changed. Not what, not the particulars, but the direction of it, the change in pressure. Okay, I said, now we find your people. That was the harder problem in one sense, though easier than it might have been. A child found alone on the camp's eastern perimeter, with no family group and no registration. She had not come through intake with an adult, had no biometric record in the camp system, had no documentation of any kind. She had simply been there outside the wire alone, which meant either her family had been separated from her in transit, or they had not yet reached the camp, or there had been an incident I did not know about and did not want to speculate on in any direction, because speculation without data is not useful and is sometimes harmful. I had Davin begin a search of the camp's arrival records for any Beth family group that had registered in the past 2 weeks with a child missing, took most of the next day, and produced 2 candidates. One family group had registered 6 days before with a child absent, flagged as separated in transit through the border corridor. A second family had registered 11 days ago with 2 children, one of whom had gone unaccounted for in the census update 4 days back. The first family group's registered description of their missing child: ridge light baseline color blue-white, approximate developmental stage, a distinctive secondary ridge line that branched at the collarbone rather than ending, is a VETH genetic variance present in roughly 12% of the population, matched the child in COT7 in 2 of 3 identifiers. Possible. Not certain. The second family's registered description matched in all 3 identifiers, including the secondary ridgeline branch. I sent word to the second family through the camp's family reunification coordinator, who handled these cases with the weary efficiency of someone who had done it many hundreds of times, and whose weariness was not indifference but the specific heaviness of a person who cares too much about too many things at once and has learned to do the work anyway. A contact, a verification request. A request for them to come to the medical tent for an assessment. They arrived the following morning. I heard them before I saw them. A sound I did not have prior experience with but recognized immediately from the literature. The VETH kin signal, an infrasonic vocalization below human hearing range that the body registers as a pressure sensation rather than a sound. I felt it in my sternum before the tent flap opened. A wave of it close, moving through the tent fabric. And then the ridge light in COT7 blazed. It was not the warm gold stress pulse I had come to know. It was something different entirely. The full spectrum white that the literature describes as kin recognition response. A flood of bioluminescent activity across all ridge tissue simultaneously, the organism's entire signaling system responding at once. She sat up from a flat position in the time it takes to blink, which startled me more than anything that had happened in the past 6 days, because I had grown accustomed to her deliberate slowness. She had been lying still, and then she was upright, ridge light blazing white, the hexagonal pupils blown wide, her whole body oriented toward the tent entrance, with an attention so absolute it made the breath catch. All of the conservation, all of the careful inward stillness, gone in the instant the infrasonic signal hit her. I stood up, I said, okay. I pulled the partition screen aside. The family reunification coordinator brought them through. 3 adults, 2 older children, the structure of a VETH kinship group. All of them doing the same thing she was doing. All of them blazing. White ridge light moving across 5 people at once, the pressure of the infrasonic signal coming in waves I felt in my chest wall. They stopped when they saw her. All of them stopped. The way you stop when something you have given up on is suddenly in front of you. She made a sound I had not heard her make before. Very small, very high. Not a word, not a call. Something below language, something older. And then she was off the cot. I had not known she could move that fast. The weakness of the past week had made her careful and slow. And in a moment she was none of those things, crossing the tent floor in her bare feet. And one of the adults was already coming down to meet her, kneeling on the dirt floor of my triage tent, coming down to her level. And there was the infrasonic pressure everywhere, the white light, kin signal rolling back and forth between them in waves I could feel but could not hear. She reached the adult and was gathered in, and the adult folded around her the way adults fold around children they thought they had lost, which looks the same across species, which is the thing that gets you every time, no matter how many times you have seen it. It does not stop getting you. If it stops getting you, something has gone wrong. I stood at the partition gap and watched. The reunification coordinator was at my elbow. She was good at her job, dry, efficient. Had seen this enough times to have built a professional distance that was not unkindness, but was self-preservation. She was not completely dry at the moment. She's theirs, she said. Yes, I said. Match on all three descriptors. Secondary ridgeline branch at the collarbone, confirmed. I see it. The tent was full of light. All of them, all 5 of the family group, illuminated, the ridgelines running white and bright, the infrasonic pressure so dense it was nearly tangible in the air. She was in the middle of it. Small and amber-skinned and no longer ashen, the fever already beginning to break because the body knows what it needs, and what she needed was exactly this. Had always been exactly this. And everything I had done for 6 days had been the work of making sure she was still here to receive it. The adults noticed me, eventually. The one holding her. The one she had run to, first. The one she was still not willing to let go of. Looked up from where they were kneeling on the floor of my triage tent, looked at me over the child's head. A long look. I know very little of Veth formal gesture and custom. The camp's cultural liaison had given me a 1-page summary at intake, and I had read it twice and retained perhaps 60%. But I know what a look means when it carries weight. This one carried weight. The kind that does not need a shared language. I nodded. Don't know if that translated. I hope it did. I went outside. The camp was in its midday hour. The sun high and flat over the flats, the dust smell, the distant noise of the distribution queues on the camp's far side. I sat on the bench outside the medical tent and drank the coffee that Davin had brought me at some point in the past hour, now cold. I sat there and let the cold coffee do its work, and looked at the dust and the wire and the sun on the flats, and did not try to make the morning into anything it wasn't. Davin came out and sat next to me after a few minutes. He didn't say anything for a while, which was correct. She's going to be okay, he said finally. She is. The family, are they registered? Is there going to be a housing issue? I flagged it to the coordinator. They registered 11 days ago. They're in the camp system. They have a tent assignment. I drank the cold coffee. There will be paperwork. There's always paperwork. There is. The sun moved. The dust settled and rose again. Inside the tent, faintly, the pressure of the infrasonic signal came and went in long, slow waves that I felt in my sternum without hearing, decreasing now, settling into the low, even pulse that the literature described as contentment regulation. The kin group's collective signal stabilizing around a new center, incorporating the returned member, confirming the count, everyone present, everyone accounted for. She did the recognition thing, Davin said. Pulse, the warm gold one before they arrived. Yes, to you. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. What does that mean exactly clinically? I thought about it. Clinically, it means she had registered me as a known presence in her environment, a stable element, something that had been consistent in a situation that had not been consistent in other ways. I paused. That's what the literature says. Do you say? The ridge light in the tent had gone quiet now, the family moving toward its kin group equilibrium, long slow pulse of a group that is whole and knows it. They would take her home, their tent, in the family section of the camp, home that was a thin-walled construction on a dusty plain, but home in the only sense that matters, which is people who know you in it. The fever would break over the next day or two. The ridge light would regulate to its baseline. She would sleep through the night in the infrasonic warmth of her kinship group, and by the end of the week she would be within the limits of what could be accomplished in a refugee camp, as well as a child could be. I say she was alone for a long time, I said, and she noticed when she wasn't anymore. Davin didn't say anything. He looked at the wire and the dust. That's enough, I said. That's enough for a start. We sat there in the sun. The camp moved around us, its 100 small urgencies, the queues and the logistics and the endless machinery of people surviving in a difficult place. Inside the tent, faint and low, the a pulse of a family that was putting itself back together. I finished the cold coffee. There is a line in the Compact Medical Authority Field Manual, the current edition, not the outdated one that had caused 3 days of unnecessary crisis, that reads, "The clinical obligation of a field medical officer is to the patient, not to the operational convenience of coordinating agencies, not to administrative classification systems, not to institutional protocol where protocol is in error, to the patient." It is a good line. I had read it for the first time as a trainee and had forgotten it for stretches and remembered it for stretches, the way you do with things that matter, but do not make themselves heard unless you are paying a particular kind of attention. The Compact is large. The Compact has a great many institutions, and those institutions have protocols, and the protocols exist for good reasons, and the good reasons do not always survive contact with the specific case in front of you. The protocol said, Category 2 vector. Patient was a child with a stress response. These were not compatible facts, and when they are not compatible, I know which one I am in the business of serving. I had served it. That was all. I had done the work I knew how to do, slowly and carefully, and in the correct format, and the work had been enough, and the child was with her family. In 2 weeks, I would file the full corrective case study to the Compact Medical Archive under open access. It would mean that any field tech, anywhere in the corridor, who searched VETH pediatric bioluminescent presentations would find it. My 73 pages, and Dr. Andrus's 6, and the metabolic panel and the tissue comparison. The specific directive that had never been incorporated into field protocols. The statutory gap in data maintenance that had left 3-year-old reference samples as the basis for a containment determination. All of it in the system, findable, citable, available to the next tech in the next camp who encountered the next child with a fever glow and needed to know that it was not a contagion. That was the job as I understood it. Not just the child in front of you, but the child who would come after. You do the paperwork not only to win the argument you are in, but to close the gap that created the argument, so the argument does not have to be had again. I would do that in 2 weeks. Today I sat on the bench and let the sun do its flat, indifferent work on the dust. Davin went back inside, I stayed. The infrasonic signal from the tent had quieted almost entirely. She was settled. She was held. She was in the warmth of people who had not stopped looking for her, and the fever was breaking. And by nightfall she would be sleeping in her kinship group's tent under whatever her people use for blankets, and the ridge light would cycle in its normal blue-white, unhurried, undistressed, and nobody would flag it. I sat there for a long time. The wire and the dust and the sun, the cues in the distance, the generator hum. And from inside, nothing I could hear but something I could feel, steady and slow, the way a tide runs, the way a pulse runs, the way a family breathes when it is whole again. I had 26 years of medicine behind me, and the most important thing I had ever learned from them was not a technique or a protocol or a statute number. It was this: the body knows. The body always knows what it needs. The VETH child in Cot 7 had known what she needed every day she was in that tent. She had needed kin and presence and time, and someone willing to stay in a chair in the dark and be steady. You give a patient what they need and then you get out of the way. She had needed kin. She had needed time. She had needed someone to stay. I had stayed. The rest was documentation.